Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. I am Elizabeth Corey, founder of beatingtrauma.com, and we are here today to talk about trauma. And specifically today, I want to talk about trauma responses. Because I'll be honest, one of the biggest ways that we will kind of invalidate ourselves is to not honor our trauma responses. Most of the time, the reason we don't honor our trauma responses is because we don't know it's a trauma response. And so we invalidate the emotions we're feeling because we don't realize what's caught up in those, right? And so today I want to talk a little bit about that. In particular, when we have really strong reactions to our external world, okay, it will often make us feel like we're overreacting. And so in that overreaction, we will be like, oh my God, why am I this upset? This anger is ridiculous. Or why am I like getting this worked up over something so silly and so stupid and da-da-da-da. Right, we do this to ourselves. This is a huge part of self-invalidation. But it feels right to us to say those things because we've often spent our entire lives hearing from others how our emotional responses are too much for them. Honestly, usually it's just having any level of emotion is too much, but in particular, we learn from everyone around us how to invalidate our emotional responses. And so I want to talk today a little bit about what are some of the things that happen that can create what we might be labeling as an overreaction, right? What are the types of things that happen? And what are the triggers behind those things? And sometimes they're very obvious. I mean, there'll probably be some things I say today and you're like, yeah, of course. But some of the things might be a little less obvious. And in particular, when we don't always remember where the triggers come from, like when we don't have memories of those experiences, it is particularly difficult for us to validate those things, right? For us to honor those responses when we're like, I don't know where this is coming from. So what we can do in those cases is we can use these responses as clues. Sometimes I refer to them as gateways. So in a sense, we're saying, okay, there must be an emotional flashback here, and I'm going to follow it where it goes. And it's probably going somewhere else. It's probably going even to a thread of experiences, not even just one thing that's from before, but like many things, right? So when we can honor it, we can figure out a lot more about where it came from, and then we can heal that stuff. So we can use these experiences as a gateway to healing our trauma. So that's really what I want to focus on today. I want to say hi to Carol. Thank you for being here. But what I want to start by saying here is that a lot of times these things I'm going to talk about, these triggers I'm going to talk about today, are really hard to see because many times our response to them, two things are happening. One, we're a bit blind to the things that trigger us. I call them our blind spots because when we were a child, we probably discovered that there was nothing we could do about it. So we made the decision, right, to kind of just ignore it, block it, tell ourselves a different story, basically almost gaslight ourselves to not really acknowledge what was happening because there wasn't anything we could do about it. So we made that choice. So that blind spot still continues to exist into our adulthood. So we may be blind to a lot of these triggers. In addition to that, we may actually not have a significant emotional response because we are numbing it out. So where this particular pattern can come in the most useful way for our healing is when we can actually tell that we're having an emotional response to that thing. And I'll be honest, even that takes work. Like, it takes work to get us to a place where we can even see that we are having an emotional response, or that we are experiencing a trigger. That isn't always like a given that we'll even notice it. But when we do notice it, that's when we can use that trigger to really, like, as that gateway to more information. And that's where really big healing can happen for us. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean today. And yes, these are all from personal experience too. So you might be like, okay, Elizabeth has experienced these things. Yes, I have, for sure. But I do think that many of these things are experienced by a lot of us as a part of our healing journey. So the first one is, I personally get triggered when people tell me one thing and do another. And as a matter of fact, that happened to me very recently, and is the reason actually for this live stream topic. So when people say one thing and do another. Now, we may have, like, I don't know, a fairly minor response to that. We may be able to sort of shut it down in our system, not really react, or kind of tell ourselves it's no big deal, which is something we will often do. But other times, we will have a pretty significant reaction to that. Okay? Now, what does the emotional reaction look like? It's hard to say. It could be anger. It could be futility, right? There's a lot of different ways that, even fear, we could show up with a lot of different emotions to that particular trigger. But what we want to understand is what that trigger is trying to tell us. Okay, so what are the kinds of experiences we have had before that are playing into something like this? And the first thing that can get triggered here is if we experienced a lot of gaslighting as a child. Okay, so it will trigger a childhood of gaslighting. What is gaslighting? It's when we are told that something that is very real is in fact not real. Okay, so saying one thing, doing another, right? Can trigger a childhood of gaslighting, or feeling like no matter what in childhood, whatever we thought was the reality was always going to be turned around, and we were going to be told it was something else. Okay, it's incredibly frustrating as a child, especially as a child, because we are so connected to our inner guidance. We are so much more connected to our intuition. We haven't lost that yet. And then people are telling us that everything we think is wrong, right? So it creates this confusion in us. And I'll be honest, that can create a lot of anxiety. But underneath that anxiety is usually fear and anger about what is happening. Okay, so that's the first trigger that we may get from that particular pattern. The next trigger is that it can trigger a lack of support. So if we were in a childhood where we never really got support when we needed it, and then we experience somebody telling us one thing and doing another, even if it's really small. I mean, it may, like, again, this is where we can get really invalidating on ourselves. It may be something like, oh yeah, I'm going to take the dishes out of the dishwasher later, and then, 5 hours pass and the dishwasher has not been unloaded, and, you were really hoping that that person was going to take the dishes out of the dishwasher, right? And then you ask them about it, and they're like, oh, I had other priorities. Are you sure I even promised that? I'm not sure I actually said that. And then, right, what happens? We blow, right? We lose it. Not because this is the only time that thing has ever happened to us, but because it has happened as a pattern over a very long period of time, even decades, right? So this is about seeing where that emotion is coming from and saying, you know what? Based on everything that I've been through, That emotion is valid. Okay, maybe not about the dishwasher. Maybe only a little bit of that emotion is valid about the dishwasher, but it's valid in general in my life to feel that strongly because this pattern has happened so much, right? So that's what we really want to start to do. So I want to say hi to Katie and Trisha. Thank you guys for being here too. So the next one, and this is probably honestly one of the biggest triggers we can have, when people reject us for being ourselves. And who knows, maybe that happens when we're not even actually totally being ourselves. Maybe we're just kind of dipping our toe in the water of even considering being ourselves, right? And in comes this rejection. And again, it may not be that this person abandons us entirely, but maybe they have a whole lot of judgmental or critical things to say about it. This can be a huge trigger. It can actually trigger up what I call the isolator, which is a part of us, who really just wants to get away from this pattern. And I'll be honest, all of these different patterns can trigger up an isolator. Okay, not just this one, but this one probably does a pretty good job of bringing the isolator forward for us and making us want to isolate. Because if we can't be ourselves around people, they're like, what's the point, right? What's the point of trying? So when people reject us for being ourselves, we're going to be triggered. The childhood of conditional love is going to be triggered in that situation. So we have already experienced what it feels like to not be able to be who we are, right? And still get the love we need. And remember that as a child, the love that you needed was more about survival than anything at all. Yes, of course, as children, we have a much better sense of what love actually looks like than probably at any other time in our lives, if I'm being honest. But as a child, we are also reliant upon love from parents in the most basic forms to ensure our safety, like to ensure that we will have a roof over our head and clothing and food and all of those very basic foundational needs, right? So it's really important to recognize that conditional love for children is not just as simple as conditional love. It's like, if that child learns that if they don't change, they may lose some of the most foundational needs that a human being has, right? That's massive. That's a massive thing. So when we can look at things and go, that's a life or death situation, we can certainly find a lot more compassion for ourselves about our emotional responses to things, right? And the second one I've listed here is similar to the first, in that it triggers a childhood of erasing self for the love of others. So just in general, I cannot be myself and get what I need. That is at the most foundational level of this particular trigger, right? The rejection of like us just for being who we are. It's so fundamental to so many of us that having a strong reaction to somebody saying, yeah, okay, thanks for being that way, but I don't really like it, right? And sometimes even if people say that in a more grounded way, even if they just think that they're just providing feedback, they're giving you their opinion maybe even in a slightly less critical way. Maybe they think they're protecting you in some way with this information, like, oh, you don't want to be like that, let me tell you why. Like, still it can hit us like a ton of bricks, especially if we've heard it over and over and over again, and we've literally have parts in our system who have tied our well-being to the idea of being accepted, right? So these are things we want to spend some time understanding. The next trigger I have is when people expect us to take care of their emotions. Okay. And what does this trigger? Not surprisingly, it triggers a childhood where we were made responsible for how others felt. Okay. Now, this could be as simple as a parent saying to us, well, you've made me mad. Now I'm sad. Now I'm angry. And it's your fault, right? You are now put in a position of caretaking that parent's emotional state. And, this can escalate to some pretty severe forms, to be totally honest with you, but it doesn't have to. It can be quite subtle. It can still have an impact on us. So when people say to us, you need to do this to make me feel better, that could create a really significant response in us, emotionally speaking. It also might not. We might have a total blind spot to it and completely ignore that actually underneath the surface, underneath that numbing, we are having a significant emotion associated with that. So we want to look at how have we been expected to caretake the emotions of others. This can show up, let's say we have a particularly angry father. These are going to be stereotypes, by the way, because this can happen in all forms. We could have an angry mother, too. But you have an angry father who comes home from work and they're really, really mad. And so what you learn as a child is how to make sure you do everything you possibly can for them to keep them from being angry. Okay, that's caretaking their emotions. Or let's say, again, stereotype, you have a depressed mother. And you know that if you don't do everything you can possibly do for her, she's going to end up in bed for days and she's not going to function and you're not going to get your basic needs met, let's say, like eating food or whatever it may be, right? This is what I'm talking about. So, caretaking emotions. You have to somehow be responsible for the emotions of others. The other thing that this particular pattern can trigger for us is triggering a childhood of parentification. So this takes it a little further than just caretaking for a parent's emotions. This is where you become the parent at a very young age, right? So now you have to parent the parent, and you're only a child, right? And part of that is going to definitely include caretaking for the emotions, but it can go well beyond that as well. So really looking for people that want you to constantly be caring for them, and particularly caring for their emotions, caring for their well-being, taking their burdens on, you might have a pretty significant emotional response to this. And you may very quickly try to invalidate that because it seems like too much. But when you start looking at what is being triggered there, it's not too much. So that's the next trigger I wanted to talk about. So the next one, and I'll be honest, again, like rejection, this one is extremely common for us. But again, we may or may not even know that it's happening. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about that idea that we don't know with this particular example. And that is when people have no boundaries. Okay? I'll be honest, for most of us on this journey who have been through a lot of trauma, we grow up not even really potentially knowing what a boundary is. I get this question all the time from my clients. What is a boundary and where in the world should I even be setting it? Because most of the time someone who has no boundaries will feel very familiar to us, but that doesn't mean they aren't triggering a tremendous amount of emotion. As a matter of fact, I would say one of the primary areas where I see emotional explosions happening when there are no boundaries is actually my clients who are parents of young children, okay? 2 or 3-year-olds have no boundaries by nature. That's not their fault. That's just who they are. Now, adults that we may have grown up with, they need to. Let me here. I'm getting a little disconnect. Hopefully I didn't lose you guys. Most of the people we grew up with, if we have especially relational trauma, did not have really strong boundaries. So when we have those 2 or 3-year-olds with no boundaries, they do start to trigger forward significant emotional explosions in us because we may have grown up in a childhood where boundaries were not allowed. We were not allowed to have our own space physically, mentally. We couldn't have space. We did not have a place where we ended and another person began. Those boundaries weren't there. And then whether or not you're a parent, you can probably imagine what a 2 or 3-year-old is like, but they don't care about your physical space either. I mean, they just don't, right? And so those emotional explosions happen. And we're like, oh my gosh, why am I reacting to my child this way? I don't want to react to my child this way, my precious child. Oh, I'm a horrible, horrible human being because I'm having these strong emotional explosions at my child because they are just simply doing what 2 and 3-year-olds do. I'm horrible, I'm horrible, I'm horrible, right? So this is where we aren't doing ourselves any favors because we will never process any amount of anger we feel in our system by shaming that anger. I've never had that work. And believe me, I've done it many times. So it doesn't work. We have to recognize that in those moments we are having our childhood of no boundaries triggered for us. And I'll be honest, when we have no boundaries as a child and there are adults around us, it feels really scary, right? Really scary. Okay, if somebody comes at us, we cannot say no. That's very scary as a child. So that's what's getting triggered. The other thing that may get triggered with no boundaries is when we've experienced a childhood of chaos. And I'll be honest, sometimes chaos is a strategy for abusive families. If we're in chaos, we won't ever kind of figure out what's happening around us. We won't be able to get our hands around it. We won't be able to process anything that's happening. And that is what a lot of abusive families want. So chaos can, to some degree, be a strategy in families like this. And there are no boundaries in chaos. There's no room for them. Just survival. That's all that's happening there is survival. So when you have a young child, like I'm talking about 2 or 3, and believe me, I'm using this as an example. This is not the only place our boundaries are invaded, okay? But if we do have that, we are living in that chaotic, boundaryless world. And yes, we will have strong emotional responses to that. We feel unsafe. And yeah, we can invalidate ourselves all day with logic and say, it doesn't make sense. It's just a little kid. That's not the point, right? When we can see what's really happening in our system and we can validate that and we can give ourselves compassion and stop shaming ourselves for our responses, we can start to shift those patterns. Jan is saying boundaries are difficult to set. Guilt arises despite knowing their importance. Absolutely it does. Absolutely. Boundaries are key, but yes, the first thing we will do when we consider a boundary is convince ourselves not to do it. Every single time. The first thing we do. Then we have to go back to it and go, okay, well, why did I convince myself not to do that? What's the thought process? What's the reasoning behind that? Does it actually make sense as an adult in this world for me not to set that boundary? Start asking ourselves that question, because most of the time, a boundary is an excellent thing for us to do. As a matter of fact, sometimes the more resistance we're having to set that boundary, the more we need to set it, if I'm honest. And that's true of a lot of things, by the way, but it's definitely true with boundaries. So, the last one I want to talk about it's a little bit similar to the one I talked about earlier where we were rejected for being ourselves, but this can be more perpetual and it can apply to almost anything, which is when people are highly critical. Now, what I always say when it comes to highly critical people is we have to apply the rule of projection, okay? The rule of projection is that when somebody is highly critical, it is because they're highly critical of themselves and they're projecting that criticism out on everybody around them. This is particularly important to understand when we think of parents and children, right? So parents being highly critical, the child is taking all that information in. It's not good information for them to take in, but that's that's how the parent has been talking to themselves, right? So when a person is highly critical, they are projecting. So that's the number one rule. But that doesn't stop this from becoming highly triggering and bringing a lot of emotion forward for us. Again, we can also have a blind spot to it, at least for a while. But the emotions that come forward are coming forward because this high level of criticism is triggering a childhood of constantly being criticized for anything that we did. Okay? And that criticism also makes it extremely difficult for us to feel okay making a mistake, which is a normal part of being a human being. We must make mistakes. But for those of us from highly critical environments, we really don't feel like it's okay to do that, right? And we will often find ourselves surrounded by people who trigger us by criticizing what we do, right? Because what we do more than anything is we repeat our patterns, right? We've discussed that many times. That patterns will repeat. We will find people that trigger us. So the other one I wanted to bring up here is that it will trigger a childhood of extremely high expectations, which are rarely age appropriate. What I mean by that is we grow up in an environment where parents put on us, again, coming back to the idea of being parentified to some degree, parents put highly unreasonable expectations on us. They tell us we need to do things that are completely age inappropriate. Oh my gosh, you're 7 years old and you could not cook this full 3-course meal for a family of 6 tonight. What is wrong with you? You'll never be a full-fledged functioning adult if you can't do this. Okay, so that's an example of what I mean when I say age appropriate. Could a 15 or 16-year-old do that? Maybe, but it still might not be the best meal. But a 6 or 7-year-old, it's not going to happen, right? And maybe at some point they figure out how to make it happen, but only because they're in survival mode and they're trying desperately to do what it is they're being asked. But in the long run, anytime somebody is critical of a child that grew up that way later, they're going to have potentially extreme responses. At the very least, significant defensiveness, and certainly wanting to shift blame onto another person. That's all survival based, right? So this is what I have for you today. I really wanted to talk about some of the things that can happen to us every day and can make us feel like we are just an emotional wreck. And like, why am I responding to that so intensely? I am here to tell you there's a reason, and it's because you are not experiencing that in a vacuum, and you are not experiencing that for the first time. You've experienced it a lot. And your reaction is because it has been building and building and building and building. And you reach the enough point, right? Now, how we can sort of stop these emotional responses, definitely we have to stop invalidating and gaslighting them and bring some compassion to the picture, for sure. But the more we can recognize these things are happening to us earlier in the process and start processing those emotions before they sort of hit that heightened point of no return, it will help us, one, stop these patterns, because we don't need this in our lives, if I'm being honest. And second, stop having such an intense reaction to those things, because those intense emotional reactions tend to make other people kind of blow us off and not take us seriously. And so if we start taking ourselves seriously, then we will find another way of reacting to those things, mostly setting those boundaries, but we will find another way to react to those things that works better for us, and in many cases just stops those patterns altogether, which is ultimately what we all want here, right? So thank you all so much for being here with me today. I hope you found this helpful. This came directly from a reaction I had this morning to something. Yes, the thing that happened is absolutely unacceptable, but my reaction was, really intense. So I wanted to bring this to you because I think it matters to us in our daily lives to really honor the responses we're having to things, and give ourselves some compassion, because of course we're having responses to things. It all makes sense. So thank you all, and I will talk to you next Tuesday, same time, same place. Bye.